Workforce, pop growth, and civilians. These are some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today because, well, 4.0 Phoenix is coming into our direction really fast, and there is a lot of changes that are afoot, and some of the biggest ones, specifically the ones regarding pops, workforce, and now also civilians, have been made public, and we're going to be talking about those right now. So, for those of you who are not aware, the pop system in 4.0 Phoenix and Stellaris is going to change drastically, but not maybe as drastically as you think it is. Pops are going to go away. This screen that you have on your planet, your rulers, your specialists, and your workers, it still is going to exist in one way, shape, or form, but it is definitely going to change. Right now, all resources are generated up here, and they're coming from our pops. So in this particular case, for instance, our specialists are generating unity, they're generating science, alloys, and that sort of stuff. This is going to change. All these resources are no longer going to be produced on a by pop basis. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go into this, you can see that this particular pop, this reptilian pop, is generating 0.3 trade, minus 25 something, a little bit of stability, and a little bit of defense. And that is fine. However, it requires calculation. Tons of calculation that is just too much work, and it really slows the game down. And this is where most of the calculation in the game is done anyway, because all of these pops, all these hundreds of pops, are being calculated in the back end every so often. And every so often, I mean like every tick, so every few days basically within game time. And this is going to change completely. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all of these pops are going to go away and are replaced by a new system called workforce. And one pop is going to be generating one workforce. However, everything is going to be scaled up by 100, which means that all populations will scale up by 100. So in this particular case, instead of 71 pops, I will have 7,100 workforce on this planet, with a couple of caveats. And then that workforce is then applied to the available jobs that are done, made available, that you can then fill in, and then the planet will be generating your resources instead. Now, at first glance, that may not sound like that much of a difference, but let's put it into perspective. Let's say that you have 100 pops, and that is now 10,000 pops, which then translates to 10,000 workforce. If 200 of those workforce have a 10% bonus to production, let's say that these guys, they've got so 10% to physics research or something like that, then that workforce in physics research becomes a bonus of 2,000, which means that the workforce becomes 12,000 because of the bonus that applies to that. Because it's such a large scale, and the application of things, how things are working, those resources are more easily calculated on a planetary level because everything's being thrown on a big pile. Let's say that you have other bonuses as well. Let's say that you have a within strata sort of change. Let's say that you have this group over here. Let's say that a bunch of them have got the recently liberated bonus of 10%. What happens in that particular case is that 10% is then being averaged out over all of those pops. So let's say 200 have it, then over 10,000, then all of those 10,000 get that 200 kind of split over themselves. So let's say like a fifth of that growth is then being applied to the higher group. But yeah, it sounds a bit more complicated than it is, and I'm sure once we get the system in our hands, it will all make perfect sense. But yeah, non-uniformity is also being changed there. In addition, all of these pops, traits, specifically like anything that applies to jobs, is going to change. These are all going to be applied to workforce. So instead of physics research from pops plus 10%, it's going to be physics research jobs or workforce increased by 10%. So that's something that to keep in mind. It is going to change quite significantly in that respect. But once again, once we have the actual system in our hand, I'm sure it will make a lot more sense. This is all going to have knock-on effects on other things as well, specifically pop growth. Because the numbers are getting so much bigger, pop growth will become far more granular, which means that every single species on a planet will be able to grow in parallel. in this particular case, let's take a look here if we have a planet. I currently don't have that enabled, but that's fine. Let's say that you have 15 species on the planet. All of these species will now grow in parallel. But all the pop growth will be applied to that. So it will all be spread out over all of these species for as far as I understand, which is rather interesting. It means that every single species can kind of grow in its own way, which is nice. You know, you still have those pop growth bonuses likely on a species by species basis, but still, it's nice to see that you won't have these uniform block of pops of one species on a planet, and it does really allow multi-species empires to flourish rather than having a multi-species empires which consists of 99% of one particular species and then 1% of 100 of other ones, which we then call a multi-species empire or something along those lines. But yeah, that's also going to change. Xenocompatibility will now be a little bit more effective because of that, and that bonus from xenocompatibility will then be averaged out over all pop groups. Of course, we're going to get new species being mixed up. Of course, some of you don't want to play with that sort of thing, but species growth will no longer be a problem because of xenocompatibility, which is really nice, because if you are familiar with how xenocompatibility works, well, it basically means that you've got a ton of different pop groups with all these different traits, and that's all going to be averaged out, so we won't have those issues anymore. At least in terms of performance. Again, all of this stuff will probably be running under the hood and you won't notice much of it. What it means is that the game will effectively stay the same for most players, whilst at the same time having new systems and new performance, improved performance, especially in the late game. Another thing that is important to note is pop growth, in that case on new planets. Let's say we got a new planet over here and we're slowly but steadily growing our pops. Because of all of that pop growth being split out over multiple pop groups, it means that migration becomes a lot more important. And that's why a new pop group will be introduced. Right now we got the rulers, which will be changing to the elites, by the way, specialists, and then workers. There will be a new one called civilians, or residents if you don't have any rights. Anyway, what it means is that civilians are there to support migration and improve new planets. They won't necessarily do anything in the back end. They're still part of your general empire composition, but they will just be there in the background. They will be your small workers that don't have any particular jobs on a empire scale, and probably like there's a nice simulation for the market as well in that particular case, but they will be generating the migration towards your planet. So you will want to have a large civilian base, and I would not be surprised if there's going to be an origin or a civic start that basically says, hey, your civic population is twice as big, or something along those lines, in order to jumpstart migration a little bit better, which makes perfect sense. You know, you've got this additional group of people in the background that can move up and down on the strata side as well, which I think is really cool. I believe, as far as I understood it, let's say that I have unemployed pops. Unemployed pops over time could fall into the resident category again. I'm not 100% sure if that is correct, but in general, residents and civilians are there in order to fill up new planets effectively, which is really cool. I do like this change, and it kind of does make your empire feel bigger, because that's one of the big things that I always had problems with. 71 pops does not feel like a big empire, right? Why is this clickable? Why is this a clickable button? It serves no function. Why is this clickable? Yeah, 71 pops on a planet does not feel big, but once that turns into 71,000, or 1 million in certain cases, let's say you've got 1,000 pops on a planet, that times 100, that becomes 100,000. Obviously, you're not going to get 10,000 pops on the planet, but I'm sure some of you will try. But yeah, then the question becomes, how all this stuff is going to work. I'm really interested in how this is all going to go, because yeah, it's really interesting to see that. One thing that I also find interesting from the dev diary is that civilians and residents are being presented as largely content and non-disruptive. And I like how they're specifically saying that, like they're saying that there are situations where pops, specifically civilians, can become largely non-content and largely disruptive, which makes sense. They are still within your empire, and mass mass upheaval can be a thing. Let's say that you have your uprisings and that sort of thing, that it comes from the civilians and it comes from your residents rather than your specialists and your workers. That does make sense on a empire sort of level. So, and it does open up the door to a whole bunch of new things in terms of like ethics growth. You know, maybe half the empire does not agree with the ethics of the other half of the empire, which is then creating issues with certain groups that want to move to other planets, because, you know, all of a sudden you have all these materialist pops that are living in a spiritualist planet, and they're like, well, no, we're all just going to go over here to this astral planet instead because there's less spiritualists over there. And in that particular case, what could happen, hypothetically, is that you can get planets with different flavors. The materialist planet, or the planet of hats, or the planet of this and the planet of that, which it opens up a lot of doors. Let's put it that way. And I do like that. If we have these sort of nondescript pops working in the background, which are non-disruptive for now, unless you change the status quo and change the social contract. But yeah, your capital also will start with quite a lot of these civilians, and yeah, you'll need that in order to jumpstart your colonies. Your first planet will generally have a lot of these anyway. Think about the expanse. Wow, Earth is full of a lot of people. They'll need to go somewhere because they've got jobs somewhere else. All right, we're gonna go to the next planet, and you know, half the planet empties out because all of those migrants all of a sudden realize, oh, there's greener hills over there. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, trade, which is something we talked about last time, is going to be generated on a living standards level by civilians. So what does that mean? So if we go into our species tab and we go to our rights, we have our living standards over here. Let's say that we have utopian abundance, right? And it generates trade. Does it generate trade? In some cases it probably does. But let's say that it generates trade. We'll go with social welfare in this particular case. So instead of trade being generated by the pops on the planet, so these guys, instead that trade is being generated by the population, as in the civilians. And that, once again, has a lot of impact, because it means you want to keep that civilian population as big as possible, because, you know, living standards, resources generation is being done by them rather than by those pops. Which also makes me think that, you know, if you have unemployed pops, because certain living standards do generate certain resources through unemployed pops, I wonder if that is going to change through resident pops. So for instance, if we have species over here and we set our rights, we go to living standards and we go to, which one is it? I think, is it utopian abundance? Unemployed pops have normal happiness and produce unity and science. I wonder if that's going to shift to civilians, where instead of unemployed pops, it's going to be civilians have normal happiness and produce unity as well as science, which on a scale could be really interesting. Again, it's just shifting things around, but it makes sense on a larger scale when it comes to performance. And once again, I really do like the idea of having empires that are just big populations that have limited impact. I still have no idea why this would be clickable. That makes no sense. But yeah, it's really cool to see. Really cool to see. What do you think? Workforce, it's coming. We don't know yet. Well, probably in May is what we've been told so far. They're still trying to change some of the systems and trying to figure out what's going on there. However, with Workforce coming in, what do you think? What do you like? Do you like the changes to Pop Growth? Do you like the civilians? I like the civilians. Always more strata. Give me more strata to work with. It's really fun. Workforce, is it confusing? Because I think it's confusing for now, but once the system is there, I'm sure it'd be super clear. Let me know in the comments below. We're going to go wrap it up here. Next time, we'll have interfaces. So I've been told. Interfaces to see with the game. Very exciting. We're going to be seeing interfaces for Workforce. Let me know how you think about that. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and as always, each other.